Okay, welcome to episode 35 of the Sumer Sports Show. It's not Eric Eager and Thomas Dimitroff again. It's Eric Eager, Parker Fleming, Tej Seth. We are here in the stead of Thomas Dimitroff. And the reason why we are late is because Thomas Dimitroff happened to call me on the phone right before to talk about some things. In fact, Thomas is right here on the phone. Look at that. Thomas is on the phone here as we do the broadcast. Look at how beautiful Thomas's setup is here. Thomas, you're on air right now.
What is up? Really on air?
Yeah, really on air. We got to let you go so we can get the broadcast going. But these guys find they think the shield is incredibly cool. Yeah. So Thomas is taking a little bit of a vacation post combine and a lot of fun there. Decided that I was going to watch him go down the slopes once, all the way there. So, but we are joined by the apt replacement guys again who have almost Wally pipped me before. Tej, you were at the NFL Combine. Parker, you were back producing the best analytics that that exist in pro and college football. Fellas, how's it going?
Doing great, man. The feels like a big get a big breath before post combine pre-draft kind of regather, and it's kind of nice to have this little bit of space.
Yeah, no, doing well, and with Eric and Thomas, you guys did so many shows together leading up to this, but now we haven't been able to get the original duo back together. It's like when you see like a really good duo in like NBA, NFL, but like there's some like things that get involved in the way that doesn't let them play together, and like that's what's kind of happening here. But I'm always glad when me and Parker can come on and kind of fill that in.
Yeah, I think it's obviously good for the listeners to get a different perspective. But I also like, of course, doing this with you guys as well. It does look like we are having some. It's on my end, maybe, or it's on Parker's end, but we should be able to, or Tej's end, but we should be able to power through with this. Fellas, we have basically started free agency because the NFL scouting combine is over the legal tampering period. It is upon us. Yeah, it's really laggy for me, apparently.
I think we lost Eric. That's totally fine. I think we can. We've done the show before. We'll do it again. We'll get him back here. Legal tampering period is what we were going to talk to and get into the segment there about just how teams are now allowed to call other players and offer and move them on. I think I want to be just totally hijacked though and talk about Derek Carr first. Is that okay, Tej? Can we do that while we're waiting on Eric to get back in here? Derek Carr looks like he's signing with the Saints. Not anything we didn't know necessarily beforehand, but I saw a number that I want to get your reaction on. $100 million guaranteed for Derek Carr is what they were talking about. Tej, good idea, bad idea? How are we feeling about Derek Carr signing with the Saints and kind of their immediate and long-term horizons?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see why the Saints want to do something like this. The NFC South is probably going to be the worst division in the league this year. Every single team in the division is changing quarterbacks, and there's a lot of uncertainty at quarterback for all the other teams in that division. So if the Saints can go out and get a quarterback in Derek Carr, that we posted a graph on the Sumer Sports account today that shows that he's been about average to above average in expected points added per play every season of his career in New Orleans. He gets some pretty good weapons especially with Chris Olave in New Orleans. And I can see why they wanted to go out and get a quarterback like him and take advantage of this weak division. But you mentioned the money, and I think that's the problem with the Saints is every season since the end of the Drew Brees years, they try to fit all these older, expensive players under the cap, and they keep just kicking the can down the road over and over. And eventually the bill's going to come due, and they're not going to be able to get as good of a roster. And they haven't really been able to get as good of a roster as they have right now. But I think when you can kind of pitch to fans that you're going to be in the playoff race late into the season, you have a pretty good chance of hosting a home playoff game, depending on how the other dominoes fall. They can get behind that. It just doesn't increase their chance of winning the Super Bowl that much, in my opinion.
Well,
Yeah,
fellas, I'm
all
back.
four teams in the South had a negative point differential last year, which is just a very funny thing that I like to bring up whenever I have an opportunity of how bad that division is, and like a little bit of marginal improvement goes a long way for your playoff odds with such bad division. Eric, I think we've got you back live and on the feed here.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry about that. I changed to the backup internet here. I have no idea. This is the first time I've done this on my work computer for a while because we had some technical difficulties going in. But yeah, the Derek Carr signing, very interesting, right? I mean, you look at, I think it was Jason Fitzgerald of Over the Cap said something like, they're in a position, the Saints are, where they can't cut. They're in a position where if they just wanted to bleed out the cap in a year and like cut all the players and like just literally, go for broke, just basically, have a season where they let everything bleed. They like literally can't. Like if they cut everybody, they would be over the cap. So they have to continuously do these extensions, these restructures. And so, even if they wanted to kind of get out of this mess, it would have to be gradual because they're unable to, really get out of it there. Now, I want you guys' opinion on Carr because I've always, as a somebody who follows the Chiefs quite closely, I've always thought Derek Carr was somebody that you had to respect, but you didn't have to fear. And I always felt like, at his number, it was just always hard to work around him. Now, the Raiders did such a poor job of drafting, right? You think about like Cleveland Farrell, you think about Damon Arnett, you think of all those kind of things. I wonder if they get some moderate luck in the draft or, free agency, they're not really going to be able to play in that much. If he could have success there with an easier schedule.
I think the easier schedule definitely matters. I feel like with Derek Carr, you look at like the EPA and CPOE composite, which is kind of a good broad brush one metric that I look at off of running backs don't matter or RBDM.com is where I'm looking at that. I feel like Derek Carr has quintessentially been a guy who could run a functional offense and just maybe there was too much nonsense going around. Like you think about, without getting too deep into this, the draft picks that they've made and how those have and haven't panned out around him and the context and the off-field stuff with coaching and transition and drama there has just been suboptimal for a guy to just come in and play football. And I think the Saints could provide him an opportunity, not just against weaker competition, but also in a situation where he can kind of start fresh. Classic like change of scenery. You think about how many times you've seen in baseball, for instance, a guy gets a trade and just legitimately better, fresh start, new situation. I think Derek Carr is a really good candidate for that because I do think he has a high floor, even if his ceiling isn't as high as some of these other guys around the league.
Mm-hmm. And I do think we saw that kind of play out this season where the Raiders wanted to raise the ceiling of Derek Carr by trading for Devontae Adams. And while the floor is always there and he's been able to provide stability with the Raiders, even through the draft picks, like you guys mentioned, missing or head coaching turmoil where they have to fire a coach midseason or they're not able to get the right coach in there. He wasn't able to raise the ceiling as much as I think the Raiders probably wanted to, especially with Devontae Adams, Josh Jacobs having a career year that should have taken some of the load off of Carr. So I think there is a limitation from that aspect where he's probably not going to be able to break through and get to that top 8, top 6 quarterback level. But Eric, I think you had a really good point yesterday on Twitter where you brought up that as these really, really good quarterbacks start to retire around the league, like Phillip Rivers and Drew Brees and Tom Brady and maybe eventually Aaron Rodgers, like some of these more, average to above average quarterbacks might start to make their way up pretty highly in these quarterback rankings. And that might become more valuable depending on what contract they're on.
Well, and when I talked about this on the franchise tag article with Thomas or franchise tag podcast with Thomas, which by the way, just a plug here. I know we got off to a slow start here. At Sumer Sports on YouTube, at Sumer Sports on Twitter, sumersports.com. As of about a week ago, is live. Great article already by Tej about the mid-range jump shot in the NFL. I can't wait for Parker's first article as well. It's we have a only bangers policy when it comes to articles on the website, and I think that his is going to be as amazing too. I actually think it's weird though, right? Because as the list weakens, right, you're going to look at a guy like Daniel Jones. You're saying, oh, well, Daniel Jones had, depending on how you look at it, whether it's like QBR or EPA, a top, passer rating. So like, oh, he's a top 10 guy. It's like, but he didn't get any better, right? Like the quarterbacks left, but it doesn't mean that he like got more accurate or got better in the pocket. And in fact, I think what it does is opens up the ability for teams who don't necessarily have the strong link quarterback roster construction to win. And in a weird way, those guys get shoved to the top, their salaries get shoved to the top, and it opens up opportunities for other teams to win with defense, a running game, whatever. And in a lot of ways, those mid-tier quarterbacks actually become maybe less likely to win, because at least those mid-tier quarterbacks, if they get into a game with, Mahomes, let's say, and they catch variance, they could beat Mahomes in the quarterback game, right? Like that's certainly possible, but they might not even get there because they don't have the defense or the running game or whatever, the offensive line play to compete with the San Francisco 49ers or, the Cleveland Browns, right? If they were trying to build that way again, the Baltimore Ravens. In many ways, I feel like Parker, that is something that may be underrated in this movement in the NFL.
Yeah, and especially think about like the margins across the distribution of quarterback play. Like you have really high quarterback play, your margins for error are really large. We see like the Chiefs this year, and even the Eagles were able to come back from some close losses, and even maybe this might be controversial, but like the Vikings and one-score games had a quarterback who could help them win those games. But as quarterback play decreases, the margins become so much thinner for you to win, and you actually are worse off almost having a quarterback who last year was 12th and this year is 6th just by attrition, because then you're paying him more resources than anyone else, and you're still underinvesting in the surrounding aspects that are going to cause you to,
Parker,
win at the margin.
Are you coming around? Like, I feel like you've come out as a Kirk Cousins supporter here. As somebody who I actually consider Kirk to be like the 8th best quarterback in the NFL, but I kind of don't necessarily believe. I sort of feel like he's firmly in the group that we're talking about that maybe can't win with a lot of resources. But on one end, though, because he has Jefferson, because he is actually fairly proficient throwing the football, like he does get in those, like he beat Josh Allen straight up this year, right? Like he can win those games. I that's interesting that you group him maybe in a better category than I would. Just based upon, but look, I do agree. I think he is like a top guy, other than the elite guys, but I sort of weirdly feel like because defense and stuff like that, like, I mean, they got the game with the Giants this year. It was like the Giants had a weaker supporting cast, but maybe a better one than the Vikings had it on defense. And that was kind of the difference. But I do think like if Cousins went on a team that had more support, he certainly could win.
I think that Cousins, I've used this for college quarterbacks a couple times because some of those guys are just so highly volatile, and Cousins isn't this volatile, but I kind of like the phrase like Schrodinger's quarterback, where whatever you think about Kirk Cousins, the opposite is also true. And it's really hard to nail down at any given situation what he's going to do. I think that he's certainly across a certain threshold of talent. Like you talk about necessary and sufficient conditions for winning. I think that he's got the sufficient ability with the right context for things to go your way and you to be able to win. I think that if I'm talking about elite and looking at quarterbacks as assets going forward, he's definitely going to be a step behind a lot of the younger guys and some of the other guys I consider elite.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? So maybe he has all the necessary tools, but maybe not the sufficient ones, or somebody like me. I don't know. I think it's a weird thought, but it's interesting because he certainly is a puzzling player, because you look at his statistics, you look at his efficiencies and stuff like that, and he very much should have won more than he has to this point. And it's anybody's guess as to why he hasn't. And it leaves us open to this week, right? So we go to the scouting combine. We have players who have performed at the tippy top. I know we want to talk about some players first, but I just kind of want to jump to selfishly, I want to jump to the quarterback because I feel like this is where you get to, Parker and Tej, the Schrodinger's kind of, you get to this question of like, do you want to buy what's in the mystery box here? Because Anthony Richardson goes out, has the best performance if you look at RAS. And I also do want to talk to you guys today about kind of how one uses combine metrics together to make better inferences about players. But you have Anthony Richardson goes out as an athlete, better than any quarterback we've seen historically. We have CJ Stroud, who looks pretty good, right? In a different way. Bryce Young weighs over 200 pounds, but doesn't work out. I think that those two things are correlated. And Will Levis throws the hell out of the football the entire time. Guys, when you look at this quarterback class and you look at the league, Tej, your favorite team, the Detroit Lions, Parker, your favorite team, the Tennessee Titans, they're all kind of in that quarterback purgatory where the guy has played really well at times, but his limitations have been shown before. When you look at this class, like, does this class intrigue you as far as like, hey, this is a move on from your quarterback and possibly dip your toes into something else class?
I do think so. I think this quarterback class is really enticing from top to bottom. I think when you start with Bryce Young, he obviously was doing something to get the weight requirement up this past week to make sure he got over that 200-pound mark. When he weighed in, he succeeded and was able to kind of like get rid of some of the worry in people's eyes and cement himself as one of the top quarterbacks in this class. And then you move on to CJ Stroud, who had a phenomenal throwing day. And I think Cody Alexander of the Match Quarter Substack described him perfectly. CJ Stroud is so good, he's boring at this point, right? He's not like Bryce Young, where you have the height and the weight to talk about. He's not like Anthony Richardson or Will Levis, where the tools are like amazing, but they're not polished yet. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of discourse about CJ Stroud in this draft cycle, but he should be talked about more because he's a very, very good quarterback that's ready. And I think he could fall somewhere in between Jared Goff and Dak Prescott when he's in the NFL, because he's that type of quarterback where he can throw on the run, but he doesn't necessarily move as much as like a mobile quarterback, but really accurate and can put it all together. But then if you're a team and those two quarterbacks are off the board, Anthony Richardson and Will Levis as prospects are still really enticing. I think the college production from a passing perspective wasn't there for them, but when you have the rushing ability that Anthony Richardson has, it's going to give him such a long leash in the NFL to figure out the passing. And from Will Levis's perspective, I think the zip that a lot of people saw on his balls when he was throwing at the combine will also be something that's intriguing to them as well. So those four quarterbacks at the top there. You also have DTR from UCLA, who was really high on the velocity metrics that they track. I think second behind Josh Allen all time. So there are options here in the draft to kind of move on if you have a quarterback that is too expensive or too old on your team to a younger quarterback.
Yeah, there definitely
Parker,
seems
what
to
do
be
you think?
separation between guys who like Bryce Young and CJ Stroud are starting next year. I think that's not a question. And Richardson and Levis are projects to varying degrees. And there is kind of like a no man's land in that 5 to 7 or 5 to 10 pick range of, we need a quarterback. If we take this guy, we have a high probability that the context around him isn't good enough for him to develop into what we need him to be. And so there's kind of this paradox of the teams that could probably do the best taking the two better, or the third and fourth quarterback in this class are the ones that don't need a quarterback, and they're going to end up getting taken by someone who needs someone sooner. I don't know how you look at Anthony Richardson's athleticism and don't say, though, I think this is worth taking a flyer on. You look at that list, and yeah, there's a lot of people. Tej, I think you tweeted out about the RAS of all time, and a lot of people tweeted, that this is a list of career backups, whatever. But there are some names, there are some dudes on this list.
Yeah.
I mean, more athletic than Cam Newton and Dante Culpepper is enough for me to say, yep, given the priors that I have, given the film that I've watched, I can understand. And I tweeted this out the other day, but like, I think given what he's done at the combine and given what we've seen on film, I would rather fail drafting him than fail drafting Will Levis.
Well, I think Parker, you give such a great perspective there, because it's like we all do these pre-mortem, like we want to do, everybody in the NFL does pre-mortems on deletions, but they don't. And like, I'm going to use but when it comes to putting players on your roster, we don't do the pre-mortem. And I feel like we should, right? If you're Detroit and you go with Anthony Richardson and you go with Anthony Richardson and he fails, you're like the rest of your roster probably is going to age out by then and you're starting over anyway. But if you go with Jared Goff instead, the same thing is going to happen. Ben Johnson's going to get a head coaching job, and then it's going to be like, hey, what the hell happened to this thing? And it's like, I would rather swing for the fence and try to connect with a guy like Richardson that for all the reasons you said, but also just like, because the alternative is also going to fail. Like, it's Jared Goff. We've seen this thing happen before. And I like Goff, and I loved rooting for Detroit and the over and all that kind of stuff this year. And I really did like what he brought to the table. But we've seen this song and dance before with kind of these mid-range guys. It's like the offensive coordinator props them up, then they get a head coaching job, and then they leave, and support gets worse. And guys like Taylor Decker age out a little bit and all this stuff. And it's like the only thing that can keep you from that is a quarterback who's in everything, the guy that is the whole car, and Jared's driving the car, right? And the wheels break down. Like, why don't you just buy the whole car? Now, he could suck, but the upside is just, you need to have that upside long term, or else you're going to have a hard time. And I think for a team, who is aspirational like that, we've already seen, like, Stroud's going to go to a team, in my opinion. I like him the most out of all these quarterbacks. Stroud's going to go to a team and he's going to make them a playoff contender in year one. Like that's just, to me, how it goes, how it's easy to build around quarterbacks on a rookie deal. Like, you look at how that happened. He's going to do that. I think Young could as well. There's going to be injuries, but I think, you look at if a team like Houston got Bryce Young, and they had the Arizona Cardinals trajectory where they go from the worst offense in football in 18 to average in 19, pretty good in 20, fall off because he's hurt, and make the playoffs in 21. If you're Houston and you're a fan of the Texans, you'd buy that a million times, right? And so I think those two guys, they're going to be off the table, but they're starting right away. The other guys you're trying to hit a home run with, and I think Richardson, to me, if you're a Detroit fan, you've already kind of done what the teams that are going to get Stroud and Young have done already with Goff. You want to take that sort of next step. You've done the Alex Smith step with Goff. You need now the Mahomes step, and I think Richardson would be a great fit there.
I totally agree with you. I think Richardson to Detroit would be a great marriage for both sides, because when you look at some of the things that are going to help Richardson succeed in the NFL, I think the first and most important is not having to start right away. I think that he should go along his own timeline, and when he feels like he can pass at an NFL level, he can start, and start for whatever team that drafts him. And the Lions have that set up. Jared Goff will most likely be the 2023 Week 1 starter for the Lions this year. So having Richardson sit behind him, learn the ropes, get developed as a passer. We've seen JT O'Sullivan, who watches this show, point out that a lot of his mistakes are because of footwork, which we know is correctable. It's not things that are inherently wrong that are unfixable. So if the Lions coaching staff is able to help him with those type of things, I think he can become a better passer. And then you also look at this Lions offensive line that's really good and really versatile, and last year the Lions offensive line was running the most versatile run blocking concepts in the league. They could run inside zone, outside zone, any of the man blocking concepts. And when Richardson can come in this year and have a design rushing game that's set up to suit him, I think that can help him as well. And then, one of the overarching things is it resets your clock. If you're Brad Holmes and you bring in a rookie quarterback, it's not like Brad Holmes is on the hot seat or anything, but it gives you such a longer time to work with him, to develop him, to get that extra $20 million that Jared Goff won't be counting against the cap because of Anthony Richardson's rookie contract. So there's so many benefits to it from the Lions' perspective. I think, if you're the Seahawks and you decide to re-sign Geno Smith, but you still want to draft a quarterback at number 5, you could do that with Richardson as well, where he could sit behind Geno Smith for a year. So teams like that, where at least they don't have to feel like they have to start Richardson right away, is probably going to be the best spot for him to land. And then, as Parker's pointed out, he's so athletic, he can really just take advantage of opportunities once they happen for him.
Well, I think an underrated part of this, and Parker, I want kind of your thoughts as well. Like, Jared Goff last year was one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, or the offense that Jared Goff ran was one of the best offenses in the NFL at not converting pressures to sacks. It's only 12.8%. And we know that as a quarterback statistic, that is pretty stable year to year. Like that's kind of characteristically who you are. But we've seen Goff, that number was 20% in 2021. So he decreased that, significantly. It was 15% in 2020, 9% in 2019, 17%. That was, we saw a drop there. That's Ben Johnson's offense, that when the thing was charted pressure, it might have been the kind of pressure that wasn't necessarily all that sacky, if you know what I mean. And that is important because what we've seen, and I'm not, I'm making this comparison only because the athleticisms are similar, because Justin Fields certainly had a better career throwing the ball at Ohio State than Anthony Richardson has at Florida. But Justin Fields took 15% of his whole dropbacks were sacks last year, and one of the biggest conversion rates in the NFL going. If you can build an offense where that lack of pressure to sack conversion is easier for a quarterback to maneuver, then maybe you can avoid some of the things that are really hampering Justin Fields' production. If Justin Fields could figure that out, none of us would be talking about them possibly trading him and going with a different quarterback at the first pick, Parker.
No, I think that's completely true. That and really, like, I think the intuition behind the pressure to sack, like the importance of pressure to sack, is kind of it's like observationally equivalent between like a Goff where, hey, a guy's going to get there, but they're going to have a plan to mitigate the pressure, and it really isn't going to be that sacky, like you said. And then the complete opposite of that, I think, is the Florida Gators offense in 2022 with Anthony Richardson at quarterback, where it is chaos. His time to throw was 3.18 average. That's not just under pressure. That's in any throw. 3.18 seconds, which is just absurd. And still, he only had a 9.2 pressure to sack ratio, can clearly create. You do wonder if that's a little bit of like a structural mismatch in talent and in design of the Lions offense. Maybe, but I also think that there's like an issue of development, and him being able to sit is really, really important, because you look at, his situation last year, like it's probably true that Anthony Richardson should have been Florida's starting quarterback for at least the last 2 seasons, if not more. But Emory Jones was recruited by Dan Mullen. He has a tight, likes the cerebral, or let me say that better. He makes a bond with a guy and says, I want to develop you through 4 years. We've seen him do that. And so it's understandable, but I do think that Anthony Richardson, a lot of his issues have been in college have been contextual, and the things he can control, which is don't tackle me. I'm not going to let you tackle me. And I'm going to extend the play and go downfield. I think you have to look at him in an NFL offense and say, if I can just get him with a quarterback guy, if we can calm down the feet a little bit and make sure their offense works, he's shown the ability to play at a high level at the things that only he can control. Now that certainly bleeds into when do they get pressure? How long does he hold on the ball? Does he make the right read? That's all in there in the data as well. But again, the stuff he can control, I think he's really, really, really good at.
Yeah, for sure. And it was very, just to give our friend, JT O'Sullivan, I did really like, I watched that Florida State game live, and he made a couple throws where I was like, oh, Anthony Richardson's good, and then the thing got away from him from a production standpoint, but you still saw, he carried a pile of players for like 15 yards on a play, like the guy, and I actually went back and looked at the PFF data, and looked and saw how many drops that they had. They didn't actually have that many drops throughout the year, but there were a lot of what I would consider to be like failed completions by wide receivers in that game that I thought were not becoming of that sort of situation. So anyway, let's talk briefly about Fields, because I think Justin Fields, staying in Chicago reportedly. What do we think about that one? Because it kind of does play into this idea of Anthony Richardson, because we do have, such a high variance, obviously toolsy guy, but the passing production in the case of Fields not being there in Chicago, similar to Richardson's not being there in Florida.
Mhm. I don't think it was ever super likely that the Bears were going to trade Justin Fields and draft a quarterback at number one. It was something that we got 2 months worth of discourse out of, which was nice, but I don't think it was super feasible just from how they see the locker room, how they saw how the fan base would react to that, how excited people are about Justin Fields and especially his explosive rushing ability. I think that this is the make or break year for Justin Fields. We really saw him improve in both facets of the game. Last year, the offense was more designed around him. And the Bears have the most cap space in the league, and they have a number one overall pick that is probably going to get traded back for multiple picks. So they're going to have resources to surround Justin Fields with a supporting cast that they can feel like they can evaluate him with. And that's going out and getting offensive linemen that are available. Orlando Brown is now a free agent, Eric, but there's also receivers like everyone wants Jackson Smith-Njigba to be drafted by the Bears so that he can be reunited with Justin Fields. And if a couple of those moves happen, then I think that those excuses for Justin Fields that he got last year kind of go away. And I could definitely see him taking advantage of this new opportunity with a better offensive line, with better receivers that are more NFL starter caliber. And if he does do that, then this decision looks great for the Bears. They can stick with him long term and pick up his fifth-year option. But if he doesn't prove to do that, the Bears kind of have their answer for what they should do at quarterback, and they can start looking for other options.
Yeah, the other one that I think people may have underestimated is moving on from David Montgomery. I've always thought that Montgomery was a decent back, but he wasn't the better back, as you've shown with the rush yards over expected. Tej, like Khalil Herbert was the better back last year, and sometimes the subtraction is just as good as an addition for an offense like that. To me, it is the 1 year you got to figure it out. I think they're in a tough spot because, in my opinion, they should trade the first pick for some players too, because that's like really the only way you can efficiently use the cap space. If you go out there in free agency and you put $20 million on Orlando Brown, you put $15 million on a Bobby Wagner, and you kind of do that almost always ends up, Parker, in problems from a cap perspective, just because free agency is not an efficient way it's an efficient way to plug holes. It's not an efficient way to build a roster.
Yeah, and with players, the other thought I had about the players as we were thinking about this earlier today was just like your variance goes down if I can trade for a player that has a little bit of a known commodity. So if I'm trying to do like a full rebuild, maybe I don't need 19. Like I love, my favorite thing in the world is to break PFF's draft simulator. Not that's not a comment on the quality of the product. It's awesome, but I'm saying like just go in and be like, hey, what can I trade? I could trade the first pick down and get 19, second round picks or whatever. And obviously that's comical, but kind of the idea of like there's too much variance for me to take 6, first 3 round draft picks and expect for my team to hit on all of those and those guys to be contributors to the team. So if I can trade in a way that I get some known commodities as well as some lottery tickets in the draft and kind of diversify my portfolio, hedge my risk a little bit, that in addition to the free agency being inefficient and a little bit harder to navigate, I think is really, really important as well. I don't know that I have the strongest sense of what who they should trade with, what they should necessarily be looking for. But I mean, yeah, they should be actively calling people, I think, not just taking calls and trying to pit teams against each other here to really, really maximize their opportunity.
Yeah, I've thought, and I've proposed this a few times to people who are, Bears fans. And I said, you should think about Brian Burns, Carolina. Like that's a player who might be worth 25 million APY. And if you can, get 9 and Burns and a few other picks, that might help. You're talking, yeah, I know Orlando Brown is free, but if you can, again, look somewhere for a team that maybe is sideways with their left tackle, that could really help. But you're just not getting premium positions in free agency. Like there's the whole mission accomplished picture of the Bucks having like, Brandon Myers and Alteron Werner and Michael Johnson all in the same, holding up their jerseys, and like half those players were gone from the team in a year, and it's just hard to build that way, through it all. I here we go, and we have a good question here. Do we think the Bears trade that pick on draft day or earlier, or they know what they need in free agency? This is from Jim Monk, who is a very loyal listener to the show. I think that's a good question, Parker. You said this on Twitter. You said, why did you give away the Justin Fields thing? Because you lose a little bit of leverage there in trade negotiations. I get what you're saying, and I agree morally. I think from the quarterback's perspective, you kind of like to have the team's backing. So maybe there's some intangible benefits there. But Tej, what do you think about, we've seen this before. We saw it, with the number 3 overall pick just 2 years ago, and the Niners traded for that. Early in the process, we saw in 2018, we saw the Colts trade the 3rd pick to the Jets, even when they didn't know who that 3rd pick was, because Mayfield was probably going to be that pick at the time, and then it switched at the end. The number 1 pick, of course, you get whatever you want when you trade for it. Do you think that A, they should do it, and B, they will do a trade, to the highest bidder right now, or should they wait until late April?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think this is a great question from Jim. I appreciate him sending it in here, and I do think that if a trade is going to happen, that it'll happen this month. And I think that's just because of precedent, like you mentioned, Eric, but also it's a lot easier to strategize if you're both sides of the deal here about like your draft plan in general. If the Bears are sitting at number 1 overall all the way up until the day of the draft, and then they decide to take the deal that's on the table for them and they move back later in the draft, then they don't have as much preparation for the different scenarios that are going to happen at the pick that they move back to. But if they do it earlier, I think they can prepare more. They can feel better about the deal actually happening. And I think one of the things about this is where when they're going to trade it, they also might still be looking to trade further back in the draft, depending on what pick they end up getting. I think Bears Twitter has flirted the idea of a double trade by the Bears, where they trade back to, let's say, number 2 or number 4 overall, and then trade back even further in the draft, depending on how the quarterback dominoes are kind of falling, because we get a better sense of where players are going to go, especially in the top 4 or 5 picks, as draft season goes on, as more information comes out and information gets put out there. So I think that's another possibility for why the Bears are going to want to trade this earlier, is so that they can maybe do that double trade back. And then from the team that's trading up perspective, they can make sure they get the trade done before another team were to leapfrog them and take the quarterback that they want.
Yeah, for sure. It's such an interesting question, right? Because you build your team based upon what the assets you have available. And I think, while we'll all say this, and it was really funny at Sloan this weekend, Thomas was on a panel with Steve Palazzolo, Kevin Demoff, and Jacqueline Davidson throughout the league, and they were talking about kind of how to construct their board, with basically how to construct your board when you have needs and things like that. And we'd like to say that we just would draft the best player available, but that isn't always the case, right? So you knowing ahead of time, how your roster looks, especially when it's such a blank canvas now, might benefit the Bears a little bit. Let's talk about some other winners at the Combine. Let's talk about Nolan Smith of Georgia. This is one where 4.39 in the 40, 41-inch vertical, smaller guy, but we've seen smaller guys produce in the NFL. Parker, what do you think about this particular case, which is egregious from the basically the athleticism standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely absurd just in terms of athletic ability and what he put on. I kind of had the thought that he was like the inverse of Nakobe Dean from last year, where Nakobe Dean had a great season, was injured, was it seemed to be worse than the public knew, and he fell really down the draft boards. And Nolan Smith suffering some injuries this year for Georgia, didn't play in every game, and then I think he's rising up the draft boards really, really rapidly from this performance. I was talking to Sean on the show on Wednesday, and we were laughing about how Isaiah Simmons and like the positionless defender, that was only in 2020. That seems like that was so long ago that kind of idea happened. But I think that the issue with drafting Nolan Smith is one of like imagination or ingenuity. It's not just, does he have the sufficient talent to succeed on the field? It's, can someone use his physicality and potentially limitations of his size in a way to maximize his ability there? I think that a fit is really, really going to matter for a guy like Nolan Smith, because he can be so impactful. But then again, if you ask him to do things that might outkick his, physical limitations, he might get wasted. So the idea of, hey, this guy could do a lot of things makes the fit so much more interesting. I think he's proved that he has the sufficient skill set to run around and create chaos on the NFL field.
Yeah, is this a, Tej, you come from Michigan, is this a Josh Uche but more athletic situation? Does he go to one of those Belichick defenses and to Parker's point, is he more of like a Bruce Irvin kind of Josh Uche, Kyle Van Noy type? Or, where do we see this player? Because I agree, we talk about Isaiah Simmons, like he's had a better time of it of late, but like he started out struggling. And I think it really is about like how imaginative your defensive coordinator can be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think when you look at Kevin Cole's attribute effects, where he did a regression on combine metrics and how they affect the NFL, the two biggest for edge rushers are the vertical jump and the 40-yard dash. And we know that Nolan Smith, 4.39 40, 41.5-inch vertical. So he can really show how athletic he is. And I agree, a Belichick defense would be a great fit for him, a defense where he's standing up and he doesn't have to get into a 3-point stance that often, and he doesn't have to always rush the passer. He can kind of, the defensive coordinator can kind of pick and choose the spots when they want him to rush and when they want him to drop back into coverage. And you go back to another edge rusher from Georgia last year that really won the combine in Trayvon Walker. And one of the better things I thought about Trayvon Walker coming out was his ability to drop back into coverage and play coverage as an edge rusher, as well as some linebackers do, because of how athletic he was. And I think we could see the same from Nolan Smith, where he will be able to cover a lot of ground because of how quick he is laterally and straight line speed. And he can kind of stand up on the edge there and set the edge as a run defender, play coverage, and also rush the passer when needed to from a defense's perspective.
Yeah, I think that Micah Parsons is really given. Now, Micah Parsons is an absolute monster, and it looks like we've lost Tej at least for a little bit here. Micah Parsons is somewhat of a monster, but and we have Tej back. He's a little bit of a monster physically, but the ability to play off ball and over the edge, kind of having that ability there from a player's perspective is tough, because they want to classify you as the least expensive position when you do that. But as an asset to a defense, it sort of is amazing. And speaking of that, right? So speaking of kind of like a lower value position from the NFL's perspective, this tight ends class, right? We have Zach Kuntz, a 10 RAS score, Luke Musgrave 9.95, Darnell Washington 9.85. Washington, not even the best tight end on his own college team, but it's kind of stealing the show in Indianapolis. Talked about this on when Thomas and I did the show about tight ends a few weeks ago. It's really hard to draft a tight end high because there's just so many things working against you. And yet this class looks to have some players who are enticing from that perspective. Parker, what do you think about, this situation where, man, there are some real good athletes like sort of staring you right in the face at a position that the league needs to replenish talent at, right? It's atrophied quite a bit over the last decade. From a top end perspective, a lot of impressive names in this group.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll just plug and say that the Darnell Washington Brock Bowers debate really depends on how traditional you have to be with what you define Brock Bowers as. I know we have to call him something, so we call him a tight end, but he's about as much of a unicorn as we've seen in college football. So I'm not going to knock Darnell Washington off of that. I do think this year we are seeing a little bit of a separation in that one, Darnell Washington is breaking. So I'm going to say this and then acknowledge Darnell Washington broke this, but we are seeing kind of a split between like the more receiver types and the more blocking types in tight ends. It's almost like we need a separation of like tight end Y and tight end H or whatever to know what kind of role they're going to play. But I'm interested to see how, Washington 4.6 really was above, some of the guys that are rated peer a step above Michael Mayer in terms of speed. Right at that, both of those guys are right there, kind of that first round flip of big boards, depending on who you look at. Guys like Sam Laporta, I think did themselves a service by proving they have some straight line speed that necessarily he didn't show at Iowa in the offense that they kind of ran. And then you like to see Luke Schoonmaker, who was a little bit versatile in Michigan. I think Tej, correct me, but they had him play fullback sometimes, and he went out in the Fiesta Bowl early and was noticeably absent in that, running a 4.63. Sean brought this point up on Wednesday. Again, I'm just giving him credit because that was brilliant, and I think that episode ages well. So feel free to go back to listen to it if you missed it. But the 4.5, 4.52 is kind of the cutoff historically of like tight ends that aren't running that are a little bit different, but we do see kind of a bigger, slower tight end in this class. I'm interested to see not so much which of these players is, the best because of their combine attributes, but conditional on them being selected. Like who selected them looking backwards? Okay, what are they going to do with Sam Laporta if they take him over Luke Musgrave from Oregon State, who was involved a ton in the blocking game in a really good, robust running system. So I think there's a lot of like unobserved heterogeneity in the tight ends this year. That's really, really fascinating to me because, again, they're so valuable if they're used well, and the scheme is going to matter so much for asking different guys. The same team could draft, Will Mallory and Luke Schoonmaker and fail with one and succeed with the other. So fit, I think, is interesting. They'll observe these traits. How are they going to integrate these guys on their team?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm definitely with you there. I think like both of you mentioned, like if you can kind of stomach the fact that tight ends, when they get to the league, take 2 or 3 years to really hit their ceiling, while other positions are a little bit quicker than that, then this tight end class should be really enticing for teams. Like Darnell Washington is basically an offensive lineman that can block and do everything you want, but he also can catch pretty well. And like, that's really hard to defend if you're a defense. You have Zach Kuhns, like you guys mentioned, getting that perfect 10.0 relative athletic score, which was really good, I think. And then Dalton Kincaid, who doesn't show up, or I don't know how much combine drills he did, but like he's a great receiving tight end. I think like the only probably like not loser, but the only person or the tight end in the combine that maybe didn't blow everyone out of the water was Michael Mayer, who's probably going to be the first tight end selected amongst these. But like I think it comes back to, I think something we want to talk about, where it's like the combine shouldn't influence your draft too much. It's important to include in models. I think most teams include combine results in models, but for someone like Michael Mayer, where all the tape is there, all the stats are there, we see that he's coming from this type of offense where he was the main focal point of it. He should still go about where he was selected, or middle to late of the first round, about where he was slotted. But like him having like a relatively disappointing combine compared to the other tight ends, hopefully doesn't knock him down the draft board too much. It should just be more of a realization of how athletic this tight end class is as a whole, and that you can find tight ends on day 2 this year that should be able to impact your offense from early on in their career.
Yeah, I think even when you look at Darnell Washington's like a comp, even though Mercedes Lewis ran like a 4.8, size wise, kind of he's more of a tackle. But to your point, Tej, it took Mercedes Lewis until year 5 to have a 700-yard receiving season. So it's just really hard for that position, for you to get surplus value at that position. Folks, we have let's talk about one more topic here before we have to go. And that is, Jackson Smith-Njigba. He did not have to run the 40 because the other tests were great. Did not play this year. What do we think about him as far as didn't play this year, right? But we've seen that historically with Jamar Chase and things like that. How do we think he factors into the first round of this draft?
I think it's a little different than Jamar Chase because like JSN wasn't able to play because of like a hamstring injury, and it seemed to be like a nagging injury while Chase just sat out because of the COVID year. But to your point about that, like I think just if you see the pedigree that Brian Hartland, wide receivers coach of Ohio State, has had with these wide receivers as they go college to pro, with how talented they come into college already, but how well they've been developed, you shouldn't overthink Jackson Smith-Njigba. He was great at all the drills that he did. I think he said his hamstring wasn't ready to run the 40, which is a little bit worrisome. But just from like when you watched him just dominate in college and saw the connection he had with Justin Fields and CJ Stroud for a little bit there, as well as just like kind of what the measurables showed of him and what his relative athletic score ended up being, he should be a receiver that teams pretty strongly consider to be the first receiver taken. I think that a comp that he's gotten a lot is like an Amon-Ra St. Brown type. So I think that can really help him from that perspective where he can kind of take advantage of really good route running of finding zones and then moving up the field after that. And I think like he's definitely in play there at the top of the draft once these skill positions start going off the board.
He's one that I've seen that I think will be the biggest flip from like public boards to what actually happens, because I think we've seen TCU's Quentin Johnston, who had a great combine, is very athletic, will be a good receiver in the NFL, but we've seen him above of JSN just because I think there's some uncertainty issues with the hamstring and everything. But I do think that they'll take him over Quentin Johnston. It would not surprise me to see him be the first wide receiver off the board. What's interesting about the wide receiver and the breakdown as of kind of the guys that are there in that first early round is that you have Johnson and you have Smith-Njigba, who are both like number one guys. But if you look at like how Zay Flowers is used, even Jordan Addison's frame, and going down to a guy like Josh Downs, all of those are going to be second options, right? And Eric, you've written about how important the second receiver is, to not to minimize their importance, but to say if you're taking JSN or you're taking Quentin Johnston, you're drafting wide receiver number one. And there's a huge jump in wide receiver just because those other guys are going to need to have someone else with a little more gravity on the field to be more involved. But I don't think that there should be any red flags with JSN for not running the 40. I think that that is only negative. Like all he can do is either run slower than people think or hurt himself, like we've seen a couple guys do if he's not 100% and he needed a couple weeks. That's totally fine. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if the order of him and Quentin Johnston going is flipped relative to what the public boards have generally right now.
Yeah, and to finish this off with a couple things. Chris Olave, Ohio State wide receiver, went higher than many people believe last year. Saints trading up for him. And we also saw the number one receiver taken in Drake London, not affected much at all by not running the 40, right? So as Parker said, there's only downside there. So awesome. Well, I know we still have some technical difficulties with the show, but I really enjoyed this. This is a lot of fun. It's always cool. Obviously, we work together every single day, which is fun, but it's good to be able to chop this up on a broadcast. We will have Thomas back on Wednesday, God willing. The slopes are very much, call that, guys. So if you like the show, obviously, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, follow us on Twitter at Sumer Sports, follow us on YouTube at Sumer Sports, leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, and go to sumersports.com for all the great content that this group is producing. So for Parker Fleming, for Tej Seth, this has been Eric Eager. This is episode 35 of the Sumer Sports Show.